interesting little nuances with the US way of doing things. It's not just a case of getting the percentages. You have to get what's called electoral college votes. And to win, you have to get 270 electoral college votes. It's rather complicated and beyond the ambit of this discussion, but from what I can gather, Hillary Clinton looks like she's probably going to get about 290. So I think that's coming back to your point. That's why I think most observers are relatively confident that she's going to get it. However, having said all of that, there are two aspects that could disrupt things. One, a lot of the so-called battleground states, and I'm talking about states like Iowa, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and a few others, are quite close. And because it's a winner-takes-all type of thing for the Electoral College, if you can get Trump, for example, getting a couple more votes or a few more votes than there is currently being forecast, it could swing in his direction, and he could get that magic figure of 270. The other aspect to look at is there are a lot of undecideds out there, and maybe it's just possible you could see a rerun of what happened in the UK general election 2015, where a lot of people who were canvassed by the pollsters were very, very shy to admit that they were voting Conservative, because it's kind of stigmatic in the UK. And I think even more so, far more acute, I don't think people actually want to be seen to be aligned with Trump, other than his diehard supporters in the US. So therefore, maybe you'll see some of these people crawling out of the woodwork, for want of a better expression, and coming and voting on voting day, i.e. tomorrow. That could swing it as well. But interestingly enough, there's a crowd called Zero Hedge, and they've put out a thing saying there's an 86% chance, according to the market movements this year, that Trump will get it. And if you go back and look in history, back to 1928, when you've had markets like we've had, looking very, very sideways to down, it tends to favour the challenger rather than the incumbent's party. And on an 86% chance, going back all those years. So, it's on a knife edge, and it's really, really too close to call. But I would say, and you mentioned the Brexit thing, you mentioned the 2015 election, maybe I mentioned it, and with that in mind, I wouldn't care to put money on this one. It's too close to call. Okay.
Since we're speculating about what the outcome will be, let's look at the scenarios of either a Clinton presidency or a Trump one in terms of trade for South Africa and more broadly the continent. How do you think things will stay pretty much unchanged if Clinton were to take over?
Yeah, I think under a Hillary Clinton presidency, you will see pretty much business as usual. The Democrats, for which she's a member of the party, have had a long and close association with the African continent, far closer than the Republicans. So I think one can draw a lot of comfort from that. Trump, on the other hand, has expressed some fairly negative sentiments about Africa generally, about South Africa specifically. So I think it's fairly sure that you can bet that the Republicans and with him wouldn't really have an awful lot to do. So things like AGOA, for example, you've got a lot of signatories to that contract. Would that necessarily be as good as it currently is, in inverted commas, under a Trump presidency? I think a Clinton presidency, as I say, would be very much business as usual, and maybe even the possibility of enhancing it a bit. But I suppose with Africa generally having slid back into the shadows because of its relatively low growth trajectory forecast now because oil is so low, then I think it's not so much on the radar screen as it would have been a couple of years ago.
You say that, but obviously Africa is still seen as the sort of the 21st century frontier. Yes. in terms of long-term investment. But surely whoever gets in, there would always be that pressure from business people who are seeking to make profit.
Oh, absolutely.
To continue investing on the African continent, because we no longer really rely on aid anymore. We're an investment hub, aren't we?
No, you're quite right. And look, I think you have to look at what China's been doing in the past 20-odd years, close to 20 years, ever since they became the preeminent force on the continent, the economic force, with the demise of the Soviet Union. They've been making huge inroads into most of Africa and displacing America in many, many areas. So for the Americans to come back, they have to have a proper concerted policy. And even under Barack Obama, whose roots go back to Kenya on one side of his family, it is very disappointing that we haven't seen that much closer association of America with Africa. So as I say, it might be business as usual, but is that going to be enough to change the ties that we currently have between the two continents?
Do we really care as Africans whether we associate more with the US rather than the European Union, which is obviously quite a contender as well?
Look, I think the European Union is too fragmented a body to get awfully excited about. Yes, you'll get pockets of interest from parts of it, but as I say, it's not a coherent entity. Whereas the US is, and the US probably is in far better shape, economically speaking, financially speaking, and it's got companies that are probably more ready and willing to come into Africa. So I think, yes, it would make more sense for South Africa to make overtures to the US to come here and do an awful lot more business.
More from Absa Wealth, speaking on the economic implications for Africa with those looming polls in the United States tomorrow.